I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. This is a rush release bonus episode of this podcast where I want to help us all get to the bottom of what happened yesterday at the military detention center at Sdei Teiman. We need to learn what the 9 arrested soldiers were accused of, the manner that they were arrested, and the reason for the protests of numerous members of Knesset on the right wing, and in particular in the religious right wing, to understand what's going on in this entire episode. And in order to understand this better, I'm honored to host my friend once again, Daniel Goldman. Daniel Goldman is the founding partner of Gold Rock Capital and founder of the Institute for Jewish and Zionist Research. He is a businessman and social activist. He currently co-chairs the Coalition for Haredi Employment and is a former chair of Gesher and World B'nai Akiva. Daniel, welcome to the podcast.
Always good to be with you.
Let's start off with the facts of the case, because yesterday when it was taking place, I frankly had my attention centered primarily on what's going on in the north. So I wasn't quite sure exactly what was happening. It sounded like the military police arrested 9 or 10 soldiers. I've heard both. And it was because of supposed, and I'm saying supposed only because I don't know, alleged, it's not something which I can determine, sexual abuse of a Palestinian detainee there, someone who was a prisoner from Gaza. People were protesting on the right wing, not only some of the, so to speak, usual suspects from religious Zionism and from Otzma Yehudit, but also someone like Yuli Edelstein, who's from Likud and is a more moderate voice, generally speaking. That's what I heard. Can you now talk about what actually happened?
Okay, so I think it would be, first of all, fair to say that all of us are currently really trying to piece together from news reports rather than, beyond that. So broadly, I think I would agree with your assessment. What seems to have happened yesterday, that a group of the military police arrived on a base called Sdei Teiman. If we have a moment, it's probably worth doing a parenthesis on that. Following an investigation around allegations of mistreatment of Hamas Nukhba Gaza detainees. That arrest or attempted arrest, which was basically trying to arrest reserve soldiers, Miluimnikim, that went video live and then sort of social media fully viral. And that caused a huge amount of stir. And very quickly, politicians, public officials, and the general mob piled in. There was a call to actually go to the base itself. And again, eventually that turned into an invasion or a break-in or bursting in. Quite know what the exact word is when civilians burst into a military base. Well, what seemed to be a protest or claims of we're going to protect the soldiers or back them up, and we'll get maybe into some of the details. Various different politicians either made statements or actually joined the protest and entered what would seemingly to be against the wishes of the officers in charge of the base to go in there. Again, there's a legal aspect, which I don't think is that interesting for what we want to talk about, as to whether, obviously, like parliamentarians everywhere, they're entitled to legal immunity so they can carry out their parliamentary work, whether that includes breaking into an army base. That is a legal question, but I think we want to talk about more the public or moral or potentially religious aspects of what happened. It did not stop there. The soldiers that were arrested were moved to a separate base where the military police carries out its investigations, and there's the military court, etc. And so a second mob basically protested there and again burst illegally into the base. And again, politicians joined in, indeed encouraged this behavior, or at least some of them did. And that is where we are at today.
Okay, then let's talk a little bit about what the specific problem that these politicians have with what happened, because as far as I understand it, there are 2 separate issues. One of them is the manner in which the arrest took place. Apparently, the military police came in masked. I've also heard that they came in under semi-false pretenses, saying they wanted to question them, and they actually arrested them. That is one issue. And for that, I believe, I just saw recently in the news in the past hour or two that the IDF actually apologized for the way that went down and said that was inappropriate. The other issue, which frankly is the bigger moral issue, is, I think some are protesting, the very fact that they're being arrested at all. And maybe that means that some people either approve of abusing these prisoners or say that they don't believe it. I don't know exactly what it is. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. So again, based on what I so far have read, the investigation here was started because one of the detainees there ended up in hospital. He was sent from that base to hospital. He had, by the assessment of the attending doctor, he had been quite severely physically abused, sexually abused. I don't think your listeners need to hear from us the details. They'll find it elsewhere. And the assessment, the medical assessment was it's just not possible that he could have done that to himself, and therefore a military investigation was opened. It is also relevant to say if anybody does a search on the English news, there have been allegations about things occurring in what is internationally now being called Israel's Guantanamo Bay, that things have been happening there, forms of abuse have been happening there for some time. So this is not necessarily something which should be new, but as you and I both know, not everything that gets coverage in the overseas or the English press will necessarily get covered in the same way by the Hebrew press. That is what it is. So I think for many people, this is kind of a story that has burst yesterday, but it's been bubbling along in the background. My comment and view in the way that you've separated it out, generally speaking, I do not have too much to add value when it is, tactical decisions that army or officers or particular, should they have gone with masks, without masks, in that way, without that way. I'm guessing that they had some type of criteria for making that decision. Could be that it was a good one. It could be that it was a bad one. For me, those tactical issues are kind of the noise. And the substantive issue is, how do you act as a public official, a politician, somebody with, and in many cases, if you're a member of the government, somebody who actually has executive power, what should your response be? Even, let's assume for a moment that there was, tactical mistakes as to how this was carried out, which was offensive to the Miluimnikim who are guarding in Sdei Teiman or whatever. What is your response as a public official? How should that look like? And I think that's the thing we should be focusing on. There is maybe two other things which I think give us framing to the current situation. One is the Minister for National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, for a very long time has been calling for a law that basically gives blanket immunity to members of the security services, so that basically anything they do in the course of carrying out their duties, they will not be subject to a criminal investigation. And this takes us back to an event that happened a number of years ago around Elor Azaria, who was a medic serving in Hebron, who eventually was prosecuted for unlawfully killing a terrorist or alleged terrorist who had already been basically arrested and was on the ground and basically tied up. And he saw fit that he needed to shoot him and kill him. And I think looking at what happened yesterday, you have to look at the Elor Azaria precedent, because some of those very same politicians who are now saying they are bursting into these army bases to give backing to soldiers are the same people who claimed that Elor Azaria should not be prosecuted. And ultimately, it became absolutely clear that what Elor Azaria did was clearly against army orders, and a court of law found him guilty of unlawfully killing this terrorist.
Let me just ask a question on that, Daniel, if it's okay. I could be wrong, but isn't there a slight difference between the two cases? Because in the Elor Azaria case, the claim that many made was that he was actually dangerous still, and that the soldier who shot him, perhaps mistakenly, thought that he was still armed or still had a bomb on him. And therefore, because he was moving, he felt that it was his obligation as a soldier to shoot him. It wasn't an act of revenge, which obviously is different than sexual abuse in prison. I'm not saying that that's true, but in terms of who's defending him, it's a different argument.
I think you're making a good kal v'chomer, which is quite clearly the seriousness of dealing with prisoners under your guard and giving them minimal protection under law, irrespective of what acts they may have done or may have allegedly done. It's not clear even that all the people in Sdei Teiman, members of the Nukhbot who carried out the attacks on 7th of October, some of them are Gazans that have been collected up during the ongoing war. Undoubtedly, some of those themselves are terrorists. Many of them are being interrogated for intelligence and so forth. I'm not getting into that, but I think the moment you are creating a moral position which says Israeli soldiers are not to be held accountable for basically anything that they do when they're wearing a uniform, including unlawfully killing an arrested terrorist, or in this case, a detainee, then clearly we're on that. I think what yesterday proves that we are on a slippery slope. I should add one more thing in, which again, this is all on the record. You can check me on this. Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister and head of the Religious Zionist Party, has gone on more than one occasion on record, and Itamar Ben-Gvir, the minister in charge of the police, himself also has been on record on this. By definition, there is no such thing as a Jewish terrorist, meaning you can have an Arab who carries out a terror attack and an Israeli Jew who carries out a terror attack, and in their mind, the result may be the same thing, but we cannot define them as a terrorist. And ultimately, what you're creating is a deep moral and ethical deficit on how you treat Arabs and how you treat Jews, purely based on your political or religious outlook. I think that's the core of the issue that we are, at least in our discussion, in terms of thinking about, religious people, religious Zionist people, and so forth. I think that is the moral issue here.
Okay, Daniel, I'd like to go through some of the issues you mentioned one by one. The first one you mentioned was the reaction of public officials to what happened. Can you extrapolate? Can you tell us what exactly that reaction was that you're referring to?
So we're in 2024. We're in the populist era of politics, right? And so in the populist era of politics, the way that we do it is we do us and them. So the politicians who were calling yesterday for everybody to go down to Sdei Teiman, and ultimately many of whom led the invasion into the base, are basically saying, we are there to defend the honor of the IDF, of Israeli soldiers, okay? Which means that anybody who takes the opposite view obviously does not honor or respect Israeli soldiers. The reality is, of course, that we all respect and honor the service of Israeli soldiers. And let us say that even a number of the soldiers actually did some of these things. Whilst they should probably go to prison for that, I understand that if you're guarding Hamas terrorists for 9 months, it does stuff with your head. I have no idea. I'm not putting myself in their position, but I don't think it releases us from separating out. We love and respect the IDF and the soldiers, but we have to parse that separately from, that doesn't justify defending the rule of law, or indeed the application of that rule of law on soldiers, even if they have been serving in 9 months straight in the most terrible of circumstances. I think that is the confusion that purposefully is created by people like Smotrich and Amichai Eliyahu and Tzvi Tzukot, who basically, and of course Itamar Ben-Gvir, who set themselves up. We are the ones who are in favor of the soldiers, and it is the prosecution, the Army Attorney General, or the regular Attorney General, they are against the soldiers. No, this is about, are we in favor of the rule of law, or are we against the rule of law? So I think that's my main issue. The second thing, of course, is that you can say, and I think it would be perfectly acceptable for any politician to have said, I think the army has made the wrong decision by sending mass military detectives down to carry out these arrests, and the warrant should have been delivered in a different way. And one can say all sorts of different things about whether or not Sdei Teiman should be open or closed, or under what circumstances you should keep Hamas detainees or other Gaza detainees. But when you're a public official, particularly if you are in the government, you have the added level of responsibility of, what is the effect of my words? Is it going to drive the mob, or is it going to restrain the mob? What's clear is Tzvi Tzukot, Amichai Eliyahu, Bezalel Smotrich, Itamar Ben-Gvir, they are driving the mob. They're either doing that because they don't care, or they're doing that because it serves their political requirements.
Now, I want to add something else, which I hope isn't controversial. I think that I agree with what you're saying in terms of the responsibility of public officials. I also want to say that our soldiers, whom we love and respect, our own children are soldiers, these soldiers are responsible to uphold a moral standard. I also know, and in some sense I'm playing devil's advocate here, I'm not justifying what they do. It is very difficult to be an 18-year-old, a 20-year-old, a 22-year-old in extraordinarily difficult, high-pressure situations where your life is literally on the line every single day in order to save Am Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael. That does not justify immoral behavior, but even the Torah itself acknowledges that in a wartime situation, things are different and moral calculus is difficult. The famous case of Eshet Yifat Torah, the captive woman. That story in Parsha Ki Tetzei, or not story, that law in Parsha Ki Tetzei, really indicates two specific things which I think are relevant to what we're talking about. There, if a person finds a woman, he has to wait a month before marrying her. People can look up the specifics of the law there. But it teaches us two things. The first one is that in the context of war, the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, runs wild. Things happen that would not happen in a normal context. Again, it doesn't excuse it, but we have to acknowledge the psychology is somewhat different. The things that happen, therefore, to transpose it to our situation in the prison, assuming they happened as we heard, it doesn't justify it. Again, I can't say that enough, but it's not as if you and I did the same thing. It's not the same context. The second half of it, though, is also important, which is that the Torah therefore says you still can't do it. You have to make sure that you have some way, as Rashi says, Lo dibra Torah ela keneged hara. The Torah is only speaking because of the evil inclination. This is a bad thing, and if you're going to do it at all, it's still bad, but at least you have to do it in a moral way as best as we can. And that means that we cannot have this idea, as far as I'm concerned, of IDF soldiers getting a blanket exemption. The Torah itself says, no, they don't. The Torah, this value in the Torah, obviously it's not the same case, but the value is the same. Yes, we understand it's difficult to be under fire. That doesn't mean that you have no more moral calculus. It means you still have to work under these very difficult conditions and do the best that you can. And I think clearly what we're talking about here, sexual abuse of prisoners, is a violation of that. I have Rahmanis, I have genuine compassion for soldiers who are under these very difficult situations. I still think they should be arrested if they did it. Of course I do. I'm not saying otherwise. But we have to remember that these are crazy situations. And don't forget, from their perspective, these are people who tried to kill Jews or did kill Jews on October 7th and thereafter. It is not just a bunch of people who did petty theft. That's not what we're talking about. However, despite my compassion for them, even as I say, the law applies to them 100%, I have much less compassion on our politicians and our leaders who try to justify it, not just excuse it given, well, you have to understand, but who try to justify it and say they should not be arrested at all.
I think it's worth spending a moment just parsing out again the way that you've said it. And I think I would absolutely agree with you. Warfare demands that we have to do the thing which is ultimately the toughest thing a human is asked to do with respect to another human, which is to try and kill them, and in fact to kill them. And in fact, we are obligated to do so because we're going out to defend our families, our homes, our country, etc. Clearly, as you say, that automatically changes the risk of that sense of I'm in danger all the time, and I'm obligated to kill the enemy. That is clearly going to do things with your moral compass. And indeed, as with all types of morality and values, in certain extreme circumstances, we expect to see a different set of rules apply. And your description of Eshet Yifat Torah is an exact example of that. And that is exactly why, both internationally and frankly, even if there were no international rules with respect to that, as our country, State of Israel, the Jewish country, based hopefully on Jewish values, even when we are in a state of war and we are demanded to protect ourselves, and that means killing the enemy, we need to put geder, we need to put fences around that so that we do not, end up on the same level as the people, God forbid, that we are fighting, lahavdil. And I think the combination of a heightened ultra-national sense of all Arabs are in favor of the Hamas, all Gaza residents are basically the same, which is messages that we hear on a fairly repeated occasion, can indeed confuse people that even when somebody has been arrested and is detained or in prison, as far as I'm concerned, he's the same guy as the person who's coming at me with a knife or a gun or a bomb, and therefore his judgment should be the same, and I'm entitled to carry out that judgment. And again, packing all those things together, I am mandated by the country and by my officers to go and attack the enemy. I'm not doing that on my own behalf or as an individual. Taking the law, in that case, into my own hand is clearly a dereliction of that mandate and duty. Clearly, in warfare, there are going to be more gray areas around where those things happened than in peacetime. That's exactly why you need to be even more specific and careful about how you conduct warfare and dealing with those things. So I have all of the sympathy for people who have to deal with that. And thank God I'm too old to be there myself. But your kids, my son, and everybody else that we know who's got people involved in this, they need to be protected by having rules in place so that they do not actually fall into those sorts of traps.
Absolutely. I want to mention something else that somebody whom I respect very much wrote to me. And again, playing somewhat of devil's advocate, I want to say what he said. He said, they don't speak a moral Western language. He's speaking of people in Gaza. It's about culture. We need to discuss things in their language, or they'll just go back home, feel successful, and do it again and again and again. Now, the idea that somehow morality does not apply because they speak a different language is something which I don't agree with. On the other hand, there are people who will say this, and they're not coming from a nationalistic perspective necessarily. They're saying that when people like you and me will say things like, we have to act in a certain way towards them, these others will argue, those Hamas members are laughing at us because we're not getting it. We're treating them, in some ways, they will argue, as good or better than our own Jewish prisoners who are imprisoned for local crimes in Israel. And these are people who literally killed people or tried to kill people in Israel as a nationalistic crime against Am Yisrael. And by just putting them in prison and giving them classes and giving them the ability to cook and all the other wonderful things that we provide for them, we're encouraging them to realize prison isn't so bad and eventually they're going to be released. And the best thing we could do, playing devil's advocate, is to kill them and make their prison time terrible so that therefore people learn, oh, it's not going to work. I'm not arguing that, but I've heard this argument many times.
So, first of all, I think even if you can justify absolutely everything that the IDF has done in Gaza since the beginning of the war, okay, and I think probably the vast majority of that can be easily justified, I don't think we're showing any meaningful mercy to the people of Gaza and Hamas in particular, and there is no reason for us to do so. I'm not sure why people think that that is sending some type of message of weakness. And the second thing is our mission as the sons of Abraham and the sons of Moshe, but particularly maybe Abraham, is actually we bring moral monotheism to the world. And if God has decided that the land of Israel is in the Middle East, then he has a pretty good reason for setting it up that way. And therefore, I'm not going to measure myself by the morals of my enemy. I'm going to measure myself by my own morals. That's not because I'm weak. That's not because I believe you should defeat the enemy. And whoever in the military situation needs to be put to death will be put to death. By the way, it is on the Israeli law books that we can indeed execute terrorists. Okay, so we have the legal power to do so. Again, to the best of my knowledge, this has always been left as an unused tool on the advice of the security forces themselves, because they believe, perhaps rightly, perhaps wrongly, and that's a reasonable debate, that actually it does not really create any meaningful deterrent, potentially the worst, the opposite. But we do have that on the books. It is considered to be legal in Israel to execute terrorists. But again, under due process, once they become arrested or detained, neutralized, we're no longer on the battlefield, and therefore a different rule applies. That's the El Azaria parallel.
And that's all about living, frankly, in a state of law rather than a state of anarchy.
Absolutely. By the way, even non-democratic countries need the rule of law in order to survive. I'm hoping that we all want to live in a democratic country, which absolutely can only survive if we follow the law.
And when people say, as I've heard many times, well-meaning people, that person is a killer, he deserves to die, he tried to kill a busload of people, the answer is yes. And if it were in the process of his doing it, of course, someone should shoot him. However, once he's been arrested, you cannot take the law into your own hands. That's not how rule of law works. I'd like to move forward to something you said towards the beginning of our conversation. You said you wanted to speak about Sdei Teiman in parentheses. Could you talk about that for a moment?
So Sdei Teiman has been subject of some controversy. And it also, again, without sort of getting into the laborious details, there seems to be some controversy as to who actually is responsible for the internment there, whether it's a purely military matter or it comes under the prison service, which would mean does it come under the Sar Bitachon, Gallant, or does it come under the Sar Bitachon Ben Gvir? But there have been a series of legal claims around mistreatment and that it's not a fitting place to hold detainees of any sort. And indeed, I haven't had the time to look into this fully in detail. I think there is a court ruling which basically says it needs to be closed. Now, I personally am not an expert on security matters and therefore have no idea what one would do with these detainees if they weren't in Sdei Teiman. But again, if we're going to focus on the moral aspects of it as a country, whether it's the responsibility of the defense ministry or it's a responsibility of the prison service or the police, we have to have minimal humane conditions for people who are detained, irrespective what criminal or terrorist activities they have done. That's the country I want to live in. Okay.
That makes sense. Now, moving forward, I'm curious about the problem, and I see it as a problem. I'm sure you do as well. The silence of too many people in the Dati Leumi community. I'm referring to the leaders, the rabbis. I haven't looked at all of them, obviously, I don't know, but many people are complaining about the fact that our religious leaders are not condemning the mob violence that took place yesterday when people invaded Sdei Teiman, when they invaded this military prison, and even condemned the fact that they were encouraged by Chavrei Knesset. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, that's just a general sigh. I don't have a very sort of black and white thought on this. I think partially what tends to happen is that a certain group of rabbis are always more comfortable talking publicly about public issues, and most rabbis actually prefer not to be involved in that. They consider that to be politics or policy and less around, teaching of Torah or, community leadership. But what that tends to do is it sort of leaves a vacuum for those who are more vocal to make comments. By way of example, last week, a particular group of religious Zionist rabbis, I think they call themselves Rabbanei Eretz Israel or something of that nature, they put out a statement basically against the currently negotiated or being negotiated hostage deal, which would bring a number of the Israeli hostages home in return for the release of some Hamas terrorists, etc. Whereas it would be almost impossible to consider a situation where you'll see a similar but opposite group of rabbis writing a letter saying, we are in favor of. And whilst you and I could probably do a debate game that says, I'm going to take for the deal and you're going to take against the deal, and we'll probably be able to debate that as mature individuals from either a political, security, or religious standpoint. What tends to happen is the louder voices take one particular view, and I think that's why we often see a very one-sided rabbinic voice. I'm going to say something which I may regret, but having been in this realm for quite a long time, I have reduced my expectations to nearly zero, that there will be a sort of outcry, rabbinic outcry. And what tends to happen is a very small number of the same guys will, take the opposite view, whether it's respect to yesterday or Noah Zaria, or we haven't even talked about Amiram Ben Uliel, the Duma murderer, terrorist, okay, which also received a petition signed by rabbis that you and I actually have a great deal of time and respect for. And I was just like perplexed as to why they would sign a petition on behalf of the rights or even the release of a convicted, basically terrorist, a Jewish terrorist who murdered an Arab family in their sleep. But this is a repeating occurrence. I think it reflects very badly, in my opinion, on the moral fiber of the community. I would love for there to be a louder, more robust rabbinic debate between, I would even be fine for different rabbis to have different views and express them publicly. But, it doesn't happen, and I've sort of reduced my expectations. I think partly in an age where outrage is the, retail language of politics, anybody who comes with a minority opinion, unfortunately, particularly if it's around a humanistic view of Judaism, will probably immediately be shouted down. And I think that does create a situation where they pick and choose fights very, very rarely. Interestingly enough, this Thursday, 2 days' time, there is a conference in Kibbutz Saad, which is a gathering of what one might call the more moderate or perhaps liberal end of the religious Zionist community, to try and actually debate openly some of these issues and, create a wider coalition of public organizations, rabbis, educators, etc. So actually to have a louder voice on these issues, we'll see. It's the first, I think, attempt at that. I think it does come in response to the some of the things that we've been talking about.
I will just say that that letter you mentioned a couple of minutes ago by Rabbanei Eretz Yisrael, or whatever that group is called, to me, the problem really is not that they have an opinion. Of course, they're entitled to their opinion. But this is a matter which, and I'm not expressing my own opinion on this, it's not relevant because I don't know enough. But at the moment, at least as far as we know, the four primary security chiefs are all in favor of this hostage deal. That doesn't make it a good idea. It does not. It doesn't mean that their word is the be-all and end-all. But I also believe that the rabbis who are protesting it do not know more than them. They are not privy to secret information, and therefore for them to express it as rabbis, they're essentially taking a security question and turning it into a religious question, and thereby making it more difficult for people to support a potential deal, not because it's necessarily a bad deal, which it might be, but because they're turning it into a Torah issue. And I think that's fundamentally unfair and, frankly, a type of kilayim, a type of forbidden mixture, in my opinion.
So it's a segue into maybe one other subject that I would like to talk about with you today. Over the course of many years, the level of trust and respect between elements of the religious Zionist community, it could be that it's started as marginal elements, but I think that sense is growing, the sense of trust between the community and the IDF or prosecution, police, particularly the IDF officers who are in charge of Judea and Samaria, and there's been an erosion of that confidence. And I think parts of the community now immediately take a skeptical view as soon as an IDF general gives an opinion which is at this sort of nexus between politics and security. So obviously, a deal to bring back the hostages ultimately is a political decision, which has massive potential current and future security implications. There has been I think, a fairly organized campaign of delegitimization of IDF generals over quite a long period of time, which now says they have been infiltrated by postmodern ideas. They go to these funded training courses like Wexner and so on and so forth. And effectively, it is an infiltration of the left or secular elites to control the Israeli army and indeed bring, I heard one person shouting outside the base yesterday, a sort of Gentile or Christian morality to the way that we prosecute our security matters. That is not new. That has been taking place for a long period of time. I remember when I was doing Miluim in Yehuda v'Shomron many years ago, teenagers would come up to me and says, I don't work with you. I don't give you my name. I do not cooperate with you. You are not really part of me. And it struck me, and I'm talking about like 25 years ago. And those kids are now, 35, 40. And I think there is a predisposition for mistrust. Now, it's true that it says in Pirkei Avot, Tisneh et Rabbanut. I think the natural position of an individual or a citizen is to have healthy skepticism towards authority, but a religious outlook which has placed for so many years religious importance to the institutions of state, the prime minister, the government, the president, obviously the army. Okay, in many writings, it's considered to be that the uniform itself has a certain kedusha around it. We've now really switched to an almost 180-degree position in parts of the community. Okay, we could debate just how big that is, where it's now seeing the army as a reflection of a left-wing, secular, progressive, woke elite, and they are implementing that ideology against the interests of the country, against the interests of the soldiers, against the interests of the religious community. Pick and choose whichever you want. And I think that is that's the melting pot that we are seeing, these eruptions or volcanic eruptions. I think that's the part of the background of what's happening.
Daniel, I want to end here because I want to get this out as quickly as possible. There's so much more to talk about, but I have one more question, hopefully to end on a somewhat upbeat note, despite the fact that this is not a very upbeat topic. Someone wrote to me, someone I respect, and he said something along the lines of that it's hard to conclude anything other than that we're basically deserving of another galut nowadays, another exile, because the moral rot has set in. And I strongly, strongly disagree with that. And I just wanted to mention that despite the good intentions of this person, I believe that Israel has its problems, but that does not mean that we need to give up on our job to become a Medina LaMofet, an exemplary moral nation. And despite the fact that there are people, maybe particularly, but not necessarily exclusively, in government who don't represent the values, even though they ostensibly are supposed to represent the religious community. They don't represent the values that you and I are espousing today. Nevertheless, the Jewish people as a whole has that moral value. The Jewish people as a whole can and should uphold the ultimate in ethical and moral values. And I just want to say before we conclude that there are problems, but acknowledging the problems and arresting those and the perpetrators who are responsible for them is a positive thing, even though there might be negative things that we see along with it where people protest it. That's part of getting out the kinks. And hopefully, if we keep on moving forward, we have to make sure that we try our best to be the state that we not only deserve, but that the world can look at, whether they choose to or not is their decision, but that the world theoretically could look at as a moral exemplar. And I am certainly not ready to give up on that. And I don't think that this changes that. I think this means we have problems, but let's work it out. Israel is not perfect, and we have an obligation to try our best to make it as perfect as possible. Nevertheless, that does not detract from the fact that Israel is a very good, a very moral, and an ethical nation. We cannot be judged by our worst characteristics. We have to try to do our best to make it even better. Let's not detract from what we already have, which is very impressive.
I simply would say that I think I come in contact with Israelis from all walks of life in various different frameworks, and in particular since the attacks of the Hamas attacks on Simchat Torah, I'm just inspired beyond belief by the resilience, the heroism, the courage of Israelis in all sorts of walks of life, whether it be military, which is obviously that gets a tremendous amount of coverage, but also incredible civic courage to take on difficult problems and difficult issues. Ultimately, I think that we absolutely have the resources and the moral clarity within our country to be able to sort those things out. But it has to be said, we are going up some dark alleyways, and we will need all of the moral clarity that we can muster in order to come out stronger on the other side. I strongly believe that that is absolutely within our grasp, but it is not something that will happen unless we take an active role to do so.
Okay, well then I said I was going to finish, but then I have to ask about that last thing. What is that active role? What do you recommend to listeners?
Speaking up, getting involved, be active, find something that you're passionate about, and join in with other people in order to do that. And it doesn't matter if it is in the security, in healthcare, welfare, political activism. The great Robert Putnam teaches us that the overall well-being of society is built up from the social capital of its individuals, and that social capital is ultimately built up through mutual activism and trusting one another, and that aggregates up into a much more powerful and healthy society. I massively believe that. By the way, since we're on the Orthodox Conundrum, he's quoted repeatedly by Jonathan Sachs, and you can look it up in Morality, where he talks about that. That is how I think we as citizens have the power to improve the society. It's bottom up, and it's about getting involved and taking a role.
Okay. Well, it's always a pleasure talking to you, Daniel Goldman. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com.